After studying this module, you would be able to learn about the diverse views on self and growth, understand the Western perspectives on self and dynamics of growth, and identify the similarities and differences between these theories. There is growing recognition that Western psychologists may have underestimated the psychologies and therapies of other cultures. Certain Asian disciplines contain sophisticated therapies, and experimental studies have demonstrated their ability to induce psychological, physiological, and psychotherapeutic effects. An increasing number of Westerners, including mental health professionals, now use Asian therapies. Benefits include new perspectives on psychological functioning, potential, and pathology, as well as new approaches and techniques. In addition, the study of other cultures and practices often has the healthy effect of revealing unsuspected ethnocentric and limiting beliefs, thus leading to a broader view of human nature and therapy. Asian perspectives focus primarily on existential and transpersonal levels and little on the pathological. They contain detailed maps of states of consciousness, developmental levels, and stages of enlightenment that extend beyond traditional Western psychological maps. Moreover, they claim to possess techniques for inducing these states and conditions. These systems do differ from most Western perspectives in their greater concern with values, moral considerations, and psycho-spiritual development. Each of these Eastern traditions stresses the futility and foolishness of valuing external form over inner function. These psychologies, like their Western counterparts, are derived from careful observations of human experience. They are built on centuries of empirical observations of the psychological, physiological, and spiritual effects of a variety of ideas, attitudes, behaviors, and exercises. The vitality and importance of these Eastern psychologies, however, rest on the continual testing, reworking, and modifying of their initial insights to fit new settings and interpersonal situations, as well as different cultural conditions. In other words, these centuries old psychologies are still relevant, still changing, and developing. In this module, an attempt is being made to highlight some of the Western perspectives on self and growth, whereas the Eastern perspectives on self and inner growth would unfold in the later modules. Whereas the Eastern perspectives on self and inner growth would unfold in the later modules. Asian perspectives focus primarily on existential and transpersonal levels and little on the pathological. They contain detailed maps of states of consciousness, developmental levels, and stages of enlightenment that extend beyond traditional Western psychological maps.
The study of motivation centers on the question of why people initiate, terminate, and persist in specific actions in particular circumstances. The answer given to this question in the West usually involves some type of internal, individually rooted need or motive, the motive to enhance one's self esteem, the motive to achieve, the motive to affiliate, the motive to avoid cognitive conflict, or the motive to self actualize. These motives is assumed to be a part of the unique internal core of a person's self system. But what is the nature of motivation for those with interdependent self system? What form does it take? How does the ever present need to attend to others and to gain their acceptance influence the form of these internal individual motives? Are the motives identified in Western psychology the universal instigators of behavior? As with cognition and emotion, those motivational processes that implicate the self depend on the nature of the self system. If we assume that others will be relatively more focal in the motivation of those with interdependent selves, various implications follow. First, those with interdependent selves should express and perhaps experience more of those motives that are social or that have others as referent. Second, as we have noted previously, for those with independent selves, agency will be experienced as an effort to express one's internal needs, rights, and capacities and to withstand undue social pressure, whereas among those with interdependent selves, agency will be experienced as an effort to be receptive to others, to adjust to their needs and demands, and to restrain one's inner needs and desires. Motives related to the need to express one's agency or competency, for example, the achievement motive, are typically assumed to be common to all individuals. Yet, among those with interdependent selves, striving to excel or accomplish challenging tasks may not be in the service of achieving separateness and autonomy, as is usually assumed for those with independent selves, but instead in the service of more fully realizing one's connectedness or interdependence. Third, motives that are linked to the self, such as self enhancement, self consistency, self verification, self affirmation, and self actualization, may assume a very different form depending on the nature of the self that is being enhanced, verified, or actualized. Murray assembled what he believed to be a comprehensive list of human motivations. Many of these motives seem most relevant for those with independent selves, but the list also includes some motives that should have particular salience for those with interdependent selves. These include difference, the need to admire and willingly follow a superior, to serve gladly; similance, the need to imitate or emulate others, to agree and believe; affiliation, the need to form friendships and associations; nurturance, the need to nourish, aid, or protect another; succurrence, the need to seek aid, protection, or sympathy and to be dependent; avoidance of blame, the need to avoid blame, ostracism, or punishment by inhibiting unconventional impulses, and to be well behaved and obey the law; and abasement, the need to comply and accept punishment or self deprecation. Many of the social motives suggested by Murray seem to capture the types of strivings that should characterize those with interdependent selves. When the cultural imperative is to seek connectedness, social integration, and interpersonal harmony, most of these motives should be typically experienced by the individual as positive and desirable. In contrast, when the cultural task centers on maintaining independence and separateness, holding any of these motives too strongly, for example, similance and succurrence, often indicates a weak or troubled personality. Thus, Murray, for example, gave the need to comply the pejorative label of need for abasement. A powerful motive assumed to fuel the behavior of Westerners is the need to avoid or reduce cognitive conflict or dissonance. Classic dissonance occurs when one says one thing publicly and feels another, quite contrasting thing privately. And such a configuration produces particular difficulty when the private attitude is a self defining one. One might argue, however, that the state of cognitive dissonance arising from a counter-attitudinal behavior is not likely to be experienced by those with interdependent selves. First, it's the individual's roles, statuses, or positions, and the commitments, obligations, and responsibilities they confer that are the constituents of the self, and in that sense, they are self defining. One's internal attributes, for example, private attitudes or opinions, are not regarded as the significant attributes of the self. Furthermore, one's private feelings are to be regulated in accordance with the requirements of the situation. Restraint over the inner self is assigned a much higher value than is expression of the inner self. Doe has suggested that Americans are decidedly more concerned with consistency between feelings and actions than are the Japanese. In Japan, there is a virtue in controlling the expression of one's innermost feelings. No virtue accrues from expressing them. Of those motives assumed by Murray and Hilgard to be universally significant, the achievement motive is a most well documented example. However, the drive for achievement in an interdependent context may have some very different aspects from the motive for achievement in an independent cultural context. Several studies by Yang have sought to distinguish between two types of achievement motivation: individually oriented and socially oriented. Individually oriented achievement motivation is viewed as functionally autonomous desire in which the individual strives to achieve some internalized standards of excellence. In contrast, socially oriented achievement motivation is not functionally autonomous. Rather, individuals preserve to fulfill the expectations of significant others, typically the family. With socially oriented achievement, when the specific achievement goal is met, the intense achievement motivation formerly evident may appear to vanish. This analysis indeed fits many anecdotal reports indicating that once admitted into the college of their choice or hired by their preferred company, Japanese high school and college students are no longer particularly interested in achievement. Once a new goal is established, of course, the socially oriented achievement motive may be easily re engaged by any figure who can serve as a symbolic substitute for family members. A longitudinal survey conducted in Japan over 30 years has repeatedly shown that approximately 80% of Japanese, regardless of sex, age, education, and social class, prefer a manager with a father like character who demands a lot more than officially required in the work, yet extends his care for the person's personal matters even outside of work, over a more Western type task oriented manager who separates personal matters from work and demands as much as, yet no more than officially required. The motive to maintain a positive view of self is one motive that psychologists since James through Greenwald, Harter, Steele, and Tesser have assumed to be universally true. What constitutes a positive view of self depends, however, on one's construal of the self. For those with independent selves, feeling good about oneself typically requires fulfilling the tasks associated with being an independent self, that is, being unique, expressing one's inner attributes, and asserting oneself. Although not uncontested, a reasonable empirical generalization from the research on self related motives is that Westerners, particularly those with high self esteem, try to enhance themselves whenever possible, and this tendency results in a pervasive self serving bias. Studies with American subjects demonstrate that they take credit for their successes, explain away their failures, and in various ways try to aggrandize themselves. Maintaining self esteem requires separating oneself from others and seeing oneself as different from and better than others. Moreover, as documented by Taylor and Brown, among Americans, most people feel that they are more in control and have more positive expectations for themselves and their future than they have for other people. This tendency towards false uniqueness presumably derives from efforts of those with independent selves to maintain a positive view of themselves. The motive to maintain a positive view of the self may assume a somewhat different form, however, for those with interdependent selves. Feeling good about one's interdependent selves may not be achieved through the enhancement of the value attached to one's internal attributes and the attendant self serving bias. Instead, positive feelings about the self should derive from fulfilling the tasks associated with being interdependent with relevant others. Belonging, fitting in, occupying one's proper place, engaging in appropriate action, promoting others' goals, and maintaining harmony. This follows for at least two reasons. First, people with interdependent selves are likely to be motivated by other focused emotions such as empathy and OM that to act in accordance with the perceived needs and desires of their partners in social relations, and this may produce a social dynamic where individuals strive to enhance each other's self esteem. In such reciprocal relationships, other enhancement could be more instrumental to self enhancement than direct attempts at self enhancement because the latter are likely to isolate the individual from the network of reciprocal relationships. Second, self esteem among those with interdependent selves may be based in some large measure of their capacity to exert control over their own desires and needs so that they can indeed belong and fit in. According to Weiss and colleagues, such self control and self restraint are instrumental to the ability to flexibly adjust to social contingencies and thus are highly valued in interdependent cultures. Indeed, self restraint together with flexible adjustment is often regarded as an important sign of the moral maturity of the person. Given the appreciation that those with interdependent selves have for the self restraint and self control, the various self enhancing biases that are common in Western culture may not be prevalent in many Asian cultures. In an examination of potential cultural variation in the tendency to see oneself as different from others, Marcus and Kitayama administered questionnaires containing a series of false uniqueness items to a large classes of Japanese college students in Japan and to large classes of American college students in the United States. In both cases, the classes were chosen to be representative of the university students as a whole. They asked a series of questions of the form: what proportion of students in this university have higher intellectual abilities than yourself? There were marked differences between the Japanese and the American students in their estimations of their own uniqueness. The Americans displayed significantly more false uniqueness than the Japanese. American students assumed that only 30% of people on average would be better than themselves on various traits and abilities such as memory, athletic ability, independence, and sympathy, whereas Japanese students showed almost no evidence of this false uniqueness. In most cases, the Japanese estimated that about 50% of students would be better than they were or have more of a given trait or ability. In a series of studies conducted in Japan with Japanese college students, Takata showed that there is no self enhancing bias in social comparison. In fact, he found just the opposite, a strong bias in self effacing direction. Several studies reveal that, with respect to abilities, Americans typically give themselves higher rating than they give to others. Thus, when a comparison with another is unfavorable to self, the self enhancement hypothesis predicts that Americans should show little confidence in this estimate of their ability and seek further information. This, in fact, was the case in an American study by Schwartz and Smith. The Japanese subjects felt greater confidence in their self evaluation and were less interested in seeking further information when they had unfavorable self evaluations than when they had favorable ones. Similarly, WADA reported that Japanese college students were convinced of their level of ability on a novel information integration task after failure feedback but not after success feedback. These data suggests what might be called a modesty bias or other enhancement bias in social comparison. A similar modesty bias among those with interdependent selves has also been suggested by Shikanai, who studied the causal attribution of one's own success or failure in an ability task. Typically, American subjects believe that their internal attributes, such as ability or competence, are extremely important to their performance, and this is particularly the case when they have succeeded. Observations of a tendency to self efface and not to reveal the typical American pattern of blaming others or the situation when explaining failure have been made outside the experiment laboratory as well. Stevenson noted that in observations of elementary school classrooms, Japanese teachers, in contrast to American teachers, rarely refer to differences in ability among their students as an explanation for performance differences, even though the range of ability as assessed by standardized tests is approximately the same. Those with interdependent selves thus seem more likely to view intellectual achievement not as a fixed attribute that one has a certain amount of, but instead as a product that can be produced by individual effort in a given social context. Those from interdependent cultures have simply learned that humility is a desired response or the culturally appropriate response, and that is wise not to gloat over their performance or to express confidence in their ability. This interpretation implies that the modesty biases observed in the studies described herein are primarily the result of impression management, and that the subjects involved actually could have held different, perhaps opposite beliefs about themselves and their ability. However, it's also possible that these other enhancement biases reflect or are accompanied by psychologically authentic self perceptions. Here are two related possibilities consistent with this situation. First, given the process not to stand out and to fit in, people in interdependent cultures may acquire through socialization a habitual modest response tendency. In large part, it may be a function of the need to pay more attention to others than to the self, just as a self serving bias is believed to result from a predominant focus on the self. Consequently, for those with interdependent selves, whenever certain aspects of self need to be appraised in a public, a modest, self effacing pattern of responses may occur spontaneously. Furthermore, this modesty can be motivated by many other focused emotions that are central to the construal of self as an interdependent entity. From an independent viewpoint, such modesty seems false and the result of suppressing a natural pride in one's attributes. Yet, such pride is only natural within a view of the self as an independent entity. From an interdependent view, modest responses may be experienced quite positively and engender the pleasant, other focused feelings that are associated with connecting and maintaining interdependence. Second, among those with interdependent selves, there may not be an awareness of one's own ability in general or in the abstract. Instead, one's own ability in a given task under a given condition may be inferred from whatever cues are available in the specific situation in which the task is performed. And whatever is inferred in this way may be experienced as authentic and genuine. For example, upon receipt of feedback about their ability, interdependent selves may first attend and think not so much about their ability as about the approval or disapproval of the person who gives the feedback. If approval or disapproval can be strongly and unambiguously inferred, then the perceptions of approval or disapproval may provide a strong heuristic clue about ability. If one receives approval, one must have high ability in this situation, whereas if one receives disapproval, then one must have low ability in this situation. In the absence of a strong, enduring belief about one's ability in the abstract, such a heuristic may provide a subjectively genuine self appraisal. This analysis also suggests why those with interdependent selves may be convinced of their low ability after failure feedback to a much greater extent than they are convinced of their high ability after success feedback. Because of the prevalent social norms for polite behavior in interdependent cultures, disapproval can be more unequivocally inferred from negative feedback than approval can be inferred from positive feedback. These suggestions about the source of the modest self appraisal have yet to be empirically tested. On the basis of empirical evidence, however, this much seems clear. Those with interdependent selves will typically not claim that they are better than others, will not express pleasure in the state of feeling superior to others, and indeed may not enjoy it. A strong pervasive motive for self enhancement through taking personal credit for success, denying personal responsibility for failure, and believing oneself to be better than average may be primarily a Western phenomenon. Other self related motives, such as self affirmation, self verification, and self actualization, may also differ across cultures in similar ways. A series of studies by Steele has shown that the negative psychological impact of one's own misdeed, blunder, or public embarrassment can be reduced once another significant aspect of the self is activated and affirmed. Thus, one's threatened self worth can be restored by a reminder of another unthreatened aspect of the self. For example, I may not be athletic, but at least I am creative. To the extent that very different aspects of self are highly valued among those with interdependent selves, this process of self affirmation may also differ. For those with independent selves, it will be the internal attributes of the self that may most effectively offset each other and re-establish threatened self-esteem, whereas those with interdependent selves, it may be the more public aspects of the self, like one's significant social roles, statuses, and important interpersonal relations, that must be the focal in self-esteem maintenance. Thus, self affirmation for an interdependent self will require an opportunity to ensure that one is fitting in and engaging in proper action in a given situation. In a similar vein, exactly what is verified in self verification and what is actualized in self actualization may also differ considerably across cultures. It is common to assume that individuals are motivated to verify and actualize an internally coherent set of attributes that they regard as significant. The present analysis would imply that people with interdependent selves may strive to verify and actualize the more public qualities of the self, the ones that allow them to conceive of themselves as respectable and decent participants in significant interpersonal relationships. Furthermore, among those with interdependent selves, self verification and self actualization may even be achieved through the realization of some more general abstract forms of relation, that is, one's relationship to or one's role in society or even in the natural or cosmic system. Other social behaviors may also depend on one's mediating model of the self. For one with an interdependent self, conformity may not reflect an inability to resist social pressure and to stick by one's own perceptions, attitudes, or beliefs. Instead, conformity to particular others with whom the other is interdependent can be highly valued and state. It can signify a willingness to be responsive to others and to adjust one's own demands and desires so as to maintain the ever important relations. However, conformity to the desires and demands of those outside the important social unit or the self defining in group may not be required at all. Studies of other phenomena such as social facilitation or social loafing could also produce differential effects depending on the self systems of the subjects. The present analysis is also relevant to two of the central problems in Western psychology: the inconsistency between attitudes and behaviors, and the inconsistency between personality and behavior. Interdependent selves do not prescribe or require such a consistency between one's internal attributes and one's actions. In fact, consistency from an interdependent perspective may reflect a lack of flexibility, insensitivity to the context, rigidity, or immaturity. Social psychologists report that people conform, obey, diffuse responsibility in a group, allow themselves to be easily persuaded about all manner of things, and become hopelessly committed to others on the basis of minimal action. Even within highly individualist Western culture, most people are still much less self reliant, self contained, or self sufficient than the prevailing cultural ideology suggests that they should be. Perhaps Western models of the self are quite at odds with the actual individual social behavior and should be reformulated to reflect the substantial interdependence that characterizes even Western individualists. Sampson has argued that the reality of globalization and a shrinking world will force just such a rethinking of the nature of the individual. Many important gender differences may also be linked to divergent construals of the self. Feminist theory on empathy suggests that relations have a power and significance in women's lives that have gone largely unrecognized. An awareness of and insensitivity to other is described as one of the most significant features of psychology of women. If this is the case, then self esteem and self validation should depend not only on being able to do a job well, but on fostering and sustaining relationships. As Gilligan claimed, a willingness and an ability to care are standards of self evaluation for many women. This theoretical work is forging a new vision of dependence, one that is similar in many ways to some Eastern views. Being dependent does not invariably mean being helpless, powerless, or without control. It often means being interdependent. It thus signifies a conviction that one is able to have an effect on others and is willing to be responsive to others and to become engaged with them. In other words, there is an alternative to selfishness, which implies the exclusion of others, besides selflessness, which is to imply the exclusion of the self or self sacrifice. There is self defined in relationship to others too. According to Keshima et al., gender differences are best summarized by the extent to which people regard themselves as emotionally to others. As mentioned earlier, subjects from Asian cultural backgrounds, presumably those with predominantly interdependent selves, often provide extremely global self descriptions, that is, one's relationship to the cosmic system and inner growth. Most of what is today called personal growth aimed at by various psychotherapeutic approaches such as gestalt therapy, rational emotive therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, etc., and by the various techniques associated with human potential movement such as encounter group, sensitivity training, assertiveness training, etc., pertains to what is referred to as the development of the ego and uniqueness. On the other hand, inner growth aimed at by the Eastern spiritual approaches such as yoga, Zen, Sufism, etc., consists of transpersonal development beyond the ego state and represents, in varying degrees, a reversal of the normal ego bound state of consciousness.
A summary of this module is as follows. Modern theorists agree that we imagine ourselves in different roles as states, but this is seen as a more rational, cognitive process rather than one rooted in deeper emotional conflicts. The psychologist Torrey Higgins writes about the actual self, that is, the current self concept, and ideal self, that is, hopes, wishes, or aspirations, and the ought self, which is beliefs about one's duties. Discrepancies between actual and ideal selves result in chronic disappointment and dissatisfaction. Discrepancies between one's actual and ought selves lead to guilt and anxiety over failure in one's responsibilities. For Higgins, emotion and motivation come from these discrepancies. Roy Baumeister is another contemporary researcher who is trying to more fully explain what we mean by self, but he believes that much of human preoccupation with finding oneself is really a disguised search for a meaningful life. Therefore, to Baumeister, self might best be defined by our abilities to find purpose, to make a difference, to justify actions, and to feel self esteem.